Hello, my name is Jimmy O'Brien, and today I am presenting Runaway Trains, Urban Space and the Cost of Progress in 19th Century Cleveland and Cincinnati, which is an analysis of the dark side of the 19th century transportation revolution. The transportation revolution in the 19th century made it faster and cheaper to move people and goods around the world. Steam-powered boats reduced the cost and increased the safety for overseas travel, and this opened the door for immigration to the United States. The canal-building era connected the East Coast to the interior, but was not an effective all-weather solution because the water froze during the winter. Railroads were the next transportation innovation, providing an all-weather and all-terrain solution for the transport of goods and passengers. The railroad stands next to the internet as one of the greatest innovations in American history. Cleveland and Cincinnati had grown and prospered from the canals built in Ohio. However, the canals like Lake Erie and the Ohio River were still at the mercy of the weather. Choosing to embrace the railroads was the next logical step for continued economic growth and progress in both cities. However, this defining choice came at a cost to the people who lived and worked in those cities. Introduction of the railroads changed those cities into places of private enterprise, resulting in a social failure where communities were damaged, small businesses went out of business, and people were in real physical danger on a daily basis. The story of this paper examines the social, economic, and political costs paid by the working class so that the powerful individuals and corporations in Cleveland and Cincinnati could enjoy the capital benefits of the railroads. In the last quarter of the 19th century, train injuries were so common in America's cities that one newspaper editor remarked that anyone living in a big city, quote, must expect to be occasionally smashed, scalded, or burned to death. This is the social and human cost paid by Cleveland and Cincinnati. Historians widely acknowledge that accidents were common in America's largest cities, but primary sources for these accidents are not plentiful. Secondary sources such as Stoll's research on the Great Strike of 1877 note several reasons why this is the case. Local newspapers mainly reported the most dramatic and fatal injuries, while minor accidents were not considered newsworthy. Many coroners' records from that time period were not centralized, making them difficult to search. Railroads, being powerful economic sources, settled injuries quietly and outside of court and often exerted pressure on newspapers to censor reports of accidents and any dirty dealings. The primary sources that are available for Cleveland and Cincinnati offer insights into the nature of the accidents and the attitudes implied in the reporting. They provide a picture of the social and human costs paid by working class residents sharing limited urban space with railroads. Many collisions occurred between freight and passenger trains. For example, a Cleveland Daily Leader report from August of 1865 describes a collision on the lake shoreline. Common themes include engineers being uncertain of their train's location until it's too late, no official railroad statement to the press, and the source of the information oftentimes being a passenger. The article is brief and matter-of-fact about 4 people being injured, including one man with a broken arm. The only colorful language describes the demolishing of cars, implying property damage is more interesting than personal injury. A consistent tone appears again in the August 17, 1866 Daily Leader report of a collision with no personal injuries, using the word injured to describe train cars, suggesting property damage is on par with human casualties. A September 14, 1878 report in the Cincinnati Daily Star's 3rd edition describes storm-related damages in Cleveland, briefly mentioning a Baltimore and Ohio freight train falling through a bridge and seriously injuring the engineer and the foreman. The article focuses on property damage, dollar amounts, and train delays rather than focus on the structural failure that caused a train to fall through a bridge. These reports reflect the priorities of the time, where industrial utility and profit outweighed worker safety and human life. After the turn of the century, coverages begin to focus more on the human experience. One article details an accident caused by carelessness, asking why a switch engine was left on the main track without a flag. It opens with a dramatic list of injured parties and vivid scenes. One reads, "News agent turns several somersaults and alights upon his head." While more vivid, it still remains one-sided. No official railroad statement is provided. The article frames railroad workers and passengers alike as victims of a larger machine that is simultaneously necessary and indifferent. On November 19, 1915, the Graham Guardian published a human interest story recounting a 1905 Cleveland Railroad accident in which switchman David Moylan lost both arms after being hit by a headlightless engine. No details about the railroad company or liability are mentioned. Instead, Moylan's story is framed as a triumph narrative, how he learned to write with a pencil in his teeth, passed the bar exam, and became a municipal judge. The article right below Moylan's story is a propaganda piece from the American Association of Railway Commissioners, celebrating the, quote, partnership between the railroads and the people. The irony is striking. Moylan's survival is heroic, but the structural failures that led to his accident are ignored. These articles together illustrate how the value of human life was conditional, recognized only when framed within a narrative of redemption and rarely when seeking justice. The normalization of railroad presence through omission and euphemism in the press helps shield companies from accountability. In addition to the social and human cost, Cleveland and Cincinnati paid a high cost in terms of public health and the environment. Photos of Cleveland from the end of the 19th century show a city covered in soot under a sky filled with smoke. Even mansions on Millionaire's Row were blackened by pollution. Trees died, and Cleveland's nickname, the Forest City, became bitterly ironic. In 1882, the city enacted a smoke ordinance to address pollution from railroads and mills. The ordinance defined smoke not as a health hazard but as a public nuisance, saying, quote, anything obnoxious or offensive or which shall annoy the neighborhood. Fines were capped at $100 and directed to the street fund, but not the Board of Health. This indicates city leaders were more concerned about property values than public well-being. The ordinance gave limited enforcement power to a smoke inspector who could only act upon complaints. The ordinance also contains a proviso that allows citizens to prosecute smoke offenders at their own risk, and if the case gets dismissed, the informant has to pay the court costs. This is designed to discourage regular citizens from taking action against the railroads. Neither working-class families or small business owners who were impacted by the unregulated smoke from trains could afford to take the financial risk of losing in court. The law appears on the surface to be fair and inclusive. However, the burden of proof and financial blame is entirely upon the little guy. The legal structure reflects a broader shift in responsibility from institutions to individuals. Working-class families and small businesses harmed by smoke pollution had little recourse. This aligns with Schle's scholarship on how railroads resisted regulation, framing their presence as essential to progress. Orth's History of Cleveland, 1910, confirms the ordinance's failure. Quote, the city is seen from the distance. It appears covered with a great gray cloud. Businesses suffered a 25% loss on white goods, and the city forester estimated 20% of trees died due to atmospheric conditions. Regulation without power served only to maintain industrial dominance. Finally, railroads came with a legal and political cost. Railroads like the Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Lakeshore and Michigan Southern were allowed to shape Cleveland's geography. Tracks were laid along the lakefront with no public oversight, cutting neighborhoods off from Lake Erie. Land acquisitions were made through private deals. These corridors still remain in place today. The 2003 Lakefront Utilities and Railroads Educational Forum illustrates the persistence of this legacy. Norfolk Southern's representative, William J. Harris, emphasized the national importance of the lakefront line and dismissed the possibility of any relocation. His reasoning referenced not just freight needs but fiber optic cables, a modern version of 19th century railroad to telegraph synergy. Harris framed the line as green infrastructure, despite it blocking public access and contributing to pollution. Harris's rhetoric echoed the 1915 Railway Commissioner's propaganda, railroads as civic partners, not obstacles. His tone was polite but inflexible, deflecting costs onto the public but offering no negotiation. This is consistent with the smoke ordinance's burden shifting. Responsibility rests on citizens while corporations retain control. Harris's argument is to restate a remnant of 19th century spatial planning as green or modern. This is ironic as the entrenched lakefront railroad is blocking environmental justice and transformation. The community activists want to reclaim the shoreline for public parks and green space and to reduce noise and pollution in the city, which are the same themes that prompted some of the nuisance laws and ordinances from the 1880s onward. Harris's arguments emphasize private ownership and national needs over community and the environment. He doesn't attack the activists' argument, and said he resists them by offering no room for any negotiation. Cleveland and Cincinnati's embrace of the railroad helped them grow into major industrial hubs, but at a steep cost to public health, civic space, and environmental quality. These costs, legal, social, and ecological, continue to be felt today. The 2003 forum showed that the same power dynamics of the 1880s are alive and well. Corporate control over urban space, government deference, and citizens left to carry the burden of reform. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and please leave any comments if you have them down below.